You may have already heard of the dancing plague. This episode, it's going to be a little different. We're going to dive into possible biological agents or parasites that could be responsible. Picture this. It's a warm morning in Strasbourg in the heart of the Roman Empire. The year is 1518 and it hasn't been exactly easy. The harvests have been poor, tensions high, and disease rampant. Yet, as the townsfolk go about their day, something strange is about to unfold. A woman named Frau Troffea steps into the street. Her feet begin to move in a rhythm to a song that nobody else can hear. At first, it seems harmless, almost like an eccentric fit of energy, but soon the movement becomes wild and unrelenting. She's not dancing for joy, and it quickly becomes apparent that she's in pain. After only an hour, Frau Troffea twirls, leaps, and jerks uncontrollably. Her face is a mix of anguish and exhaustion, but still, her body refuses to stop. Townspeople gather, first in confusion and then in panic. Is she possessed? Is she cursed? What could it be? Doesn't take long for whispers of the supernatural to start circulating throughout the crowd. Days pass. Despite her swollen feet and bloody body, Frau continues to dance. By the end of the week, 34 other people joined in. They too began to dance uncontrollably in the streets as if they were driven by some kind of invisible puppet master. The crowd watched in horror. No one could explain it. None of the city's physicians had any answers, and people began to believe they were possessed by evil spirits. The dancers start to collapse of exhaustion. It's believed that some died from strokes, others heart attacks. Still, even more bizarre is that more people begin to join, and soon the entire city descends into chaos. What started as a quirky one-woman episode spirals into a full-blown epidemic of madness. And as the bodies begin to pile up, one terrifying question remains. What could possibly be driving all these people to dance themselves to death? The dancing plague of 1518 is a mind-blowing mystery that to this day has no answers. We're going to get into exactly how this thing started, what the causes may have been, how parasites could have played a role, and some of the more mainstream modernly accepted theories. On top of that, we're also going to finish the story of Frau Troffea later on in the episode. So, I just want to say thank you to everyone and welcome back. A lot of people that have been watching our episodes, over 90% aren't subscribed to the channel. It would really help us if you could click that follow button. And if you haven't told somebody about the show in the last 24 hours, do it again. I could really use your help. You guys are awesome and we'll move forward. So back in Strasbourg, within a week of the outbreak of the dancing plague, the entire city was enveloped in this. What began as a strange and isolated incident began to threaten not only to overthrow the city, but the entire area. Dozens of people were drawn into the maddening rhythm as if they were being controlled by an invisible force. No one was spared. Men, women, children, the elderly. There wasn't a single demographic they couldn't capture. Just like Disney. Day and night, the dancers moved without stopping. Their feet were torn and bleeding from the constant motion. Their bodies, though drenched in sweat, didn't stop them from going. Spectators watched in the helpless horror as friends and family members collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Some even dying on the spot from heart attacks and strokes. Their bodies pushed beyond the limits. I couldn't imagine the smell. Officials tried everything they could think of to stop the epidemic. They hired musicians, believing somehow that music would coax them back out of their trance. They allowed the afflicted to exhaust themselves, thinking it would help in a controlled way, but it only seemed to fuel the fire, making people dance harder and faster. And it drove even more people in the street when they heard the music, and they ended up joining in. As the epidemic began to spread further, the city's priests offered prayers, they offered rituals, believing that this could be some kind of divine punishment. They tried isolating the dancers, hoping that any distance between them would quell the madness. But still, the dancing persisted. I could definitely imagine that time people were scared. I can see how people would start to draw in the conclusion that this is some kind of divine punishment. Who knows what they were doing back then to deserve it. Maybe they were cutting the candles a little too short or the candle wicks a little too short, but I don't think even today, if it happened, we would be protected from thinking this was some kind of divine punishment. It would just be so weird. So weird. Actually, not really. If you look down the street, it's not weird. Just see people doing all kind of weird stuff out in the streets, talking to themselves, dancing, you name it. As the dancing continued to perplex physicians and doctors, and at that time, there wasn't a lot of medical knowledge, but it didn't stop them from taking a shot. As the city struggled to grapple with the dancing plague and the leaders tried to diagnose what it could be, They tried everything from building special stages for the dancers, bringing in the musicians that they believed could help heal them. And at one point, they even designated a special area for the afflicted to dance, thinking it might also be a key to control the madness. Yet, all these efforts just seemed to fuel the fire. As more and more people were drawn into the streets, their bodies jerking uncontrollably, their faces etched in a mixture of pain and confusion, soon the dozens turned into hundreds. The city's leaders were forced to acknowledge the helplessness of their situation. No amount of music, prayer, or rituals seemed to do the trick, and the air became thick with tension and uncertainty. Could this really just be meant as a divine punishment? That there was no getting out of it? That God just simply had it out for them? Not long before the plague had broken out, the city was already on edge due to recent crop failures, famine, and disease. It found itself traveling not just in that town, but the entire region. And in 1518, they couldn't have known that there's potential that something like a parasite or an unknown microbe could be affecting them on this mass scale. All they knew is something was wrong. It wasn't until the 1660s when bacteria itself was even discovered. So there's definitely no way that these people had any idea that something on this micro scale could be affecting them. But the one thing that I wanted to interject in this episode, and that's, I think, worth taking a look at, is parasites. Because parasites have long been masters for manipulation, controlling their hosts in ways that seem more like science fiction than reality. One of the most striking examples is the cordyceps fungus, which infects ants. It's also called zombie ant fungus. Once inside the ant's body, the fungus takes control of the ant's brain, forcing it to climb high to a point, an action completely against the survival of the ant's instincts. When the ant reaches a suitable height, the fungus kills it and lets itself grow out of its body, releasing more spores to infect other ants. It does this in a way not to eliminate the ant species, but to ensure its coexistence alongside of it. The level of control shows how parasites can not only invade a host, but also manipulate its behavior to suit its reproductive needs. If parasites can completely override the instincts of an insect, what can they do to the human brains? Could the strange dancing be witnessed? The answer is quite a bit, and that's something we're going to get into later. But it really is crazy. As the dancing plague continued to wreak havoc in Strasbourg during the summer of 1518, it became increasingly clear the situation was spiraling out of control. As the leaders and the priests start to realize that, hey, maybe we should be considering this isn't some divine punishment from God, they decide it's time to start looking at other diseases and outbreaks of things that they knew about at that time. It was a common belief that the body itself during that time was controlled by the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And these four things were essentially the essence of your body. And an imbalance of these humors could cause mental health issues and illness basically to set upon you. Doctors eventually diagnosed the dancers with something called hot blood, which is a common diagnosis, and they believed the afflicted were suffering from an overheating of the blood, and that dancing was the body's natural way of releasing the excess heat. This was the foundation for much of the early medical treatment. City officials believed that this diagnosis was the way to go. They were convinced that actively encouraging dancing was the remedy. They kept repeating the line, "This is both safe and effective." Oh God, that's going to cause trauma for generations. Anyhow, as they're trying to treat the hot-bloodedness, it doesn't take long for them to realize that it might not be the case. And the medical interventions began to take even more bizarre turns when the city leaders hire musicians to help the dancers. I mentioned earlier, one of the things that they did was actually encouraging the dancing by giving them their own space, but that just became problematic because as people were trying to help these people and get them into their special dance floors, they were just becoming afflicted themselves. And when medical interventions seemed to fail time and time again, people started turning to alternative forms of fixing this, essentially punishing people. So many people ended up believing that the dancing plague was a form of punishment from Saint Vitus, a patron saint of dancers and epileptics, and those suffering from neurological disorders. This belief was not uncommon in medieval Europe, and they blamed a lot of illnesses and strange occurrences as divine or supernatural. And in response to this, the city organized a pilgrimage to a shrine of Saint Vitus in hopes that offerings and prayers of devotion would placate the guy and he would let up on his dancing plague. They also would adorn the statues of him in these red shoes, making this makeshift shine. Again, I don't quite understand what the thinking was back then, but I don't think it's any weirder than how people think today. So as all these kind of more spiritual, or I want to say out there things are not working, it doesn't mean that they give up, and they actually start to bring in some legitimate physicians. Several contemporary writers documented the dancing plague, which gives us insight into how the people at the time understood the event. And one of the most notable chroniclers was Paracelsus, who was a 16th century physician who is often regarded as the father of toxicology. Paracelsus was super critical of the way the dancing plague was handled. He didn't believe that there was any divine punishment, and instead focused on physiological, psychological, and social elements. He proposed that at the time, a form of mass hysteria was brought on by extreme stress, poverty, and famine. Paracelsus also referred to the afflicted dancers as having a form of choral mania, and wrote extensively on how their suffering could have been driven by a combination of mental illness and physical factors. He points to early efforts at understanding mental illness and psychosomatic conditions, even if they were interpreted through vastly different lenses than modern psychology. He was at least trying at this time. This was being written in hindsight, and Paracelsus never actually visited the town himself, so he didn't have firsthand insight. What everyone then, and even to today, is relying on is the fact that the town had its own council and they did have records. They offered a glimpse into the responses to the plague and what people were thinking. They revealed the city's desperate attempt to contain and spread the dancing, and even eventually banning music and dancing entirely. Ironically, it was thought that their previous efforts to encouraging dancing, because they failed so miserably, that maybe they got to get rid of dancing and music altogether. Interesting. I wonder if that didn't spur some other decisions that we see in modern religion. I don't know. Like Paracelsus, a ton of historians over the case of the last few hundred years have tried to figure out what exactly was the cause of this dancing plague. And sometimes what's even as strange as the dancing plague is how it ended. And that's what we're going to get into later in the episode. And we're also going to pick back up with Frau Troffea. But seriously, stick around, because I want to get into what some of the historians say and talk about the role that parasites and viruses and biology can play. All right, the dancing plague. Okay, we think this thing could be, at this point, mass hysteria, some kind of famine, some kind of weird psychosis. It could be a divine punishment from a god. And it could be some kind of biological agent, something causing it. But the point is, it was very confusing at the time. My favorite theory so far, though, is that the humoral theory, where they thought it was an imbalance of the body's fluids and people just had too hot of blood inside of them. I like it. I don't know why, I just do. Anyhow, so in more modern times, some of the theories that have developed have stemmed around the possible ingestion of some kind of psychoactive substance unmasked to the entire town, or at least a part of the town. And it's proposed that it could be something called ergotism, which is caused by ergot poisoning. And ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, a staple crop in medieval Europe. When consumed, ergot produces chemicals called alkaloids that cause a condition known as ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire. Symptoms include hallucinations, muscle spasms, and convulsions, all of which eerily mirrored the behavior by those affected by the dancing plague. Now, ergot poisoning is a theory that's been widely spread, and it's been repeated on multiple podcasts and by multiple people, including historian John Waller, who believes that a contaminated rye may have played a significant role in triggering the dancing plague in his book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die. Waller suggests that ergot fungus, which produces these hallucinogenic compounds, could have led to the uncontrolled movements, vivid hallucinations, and convulsions witnessed by afflicted individuals. Ergot's hallucinogenic properties are also known to affect serotonin receptors in the brain, inducing symptoms similar to those caused by modern psychedelics like LSD. Now, despite its compelling nature, the ergot theory does have some holes in it. It's been criticized for not fully explaining the scale and coordination of the dancing that spread rapidly throughout Strasbourg. Anybody that knows much about psychoactive substances knows that, yes, you can have a group effect, but to have a controlled group effect on psychedelics seems almost impossible. Every individual brain is reacting differently to the drug that they ingest, because they're not only at different amounts, It's just all your past experiences, everything about you affects how that drug affects you. Despite the compelling nature of the ergot theory, I also don't buy it. And there is a compelling paper written by Peter Carlson and is published in 2012 in the Lancet Journal. And it argues that the levels of psychoactive substances in ergot may not have been sufficient to cause mass synchronized behavior at the scale seen in this dancing plague. So essentially what you're getting with ergot is a low dose of LSD, which is enough to affect you, but it's not enough to possibly compel you or throw you into full-on hallucinations. And especially all these people who are different sizes, different weights, and in such a coordinated way. It just doesn't seem to me that there's any way a shared dose of a hallucinogen could cause this. And furthermore, there's something that maybe isn't being talked about, which is in LSD and psilocybin in particular, there's a very quick, almost exponential development of tolerance to it. So that if you trip on, say, 3 grams of psilocybin today, it's going to take you 6 grams tomorrow, 12 grams the next day. So the idea that they could be probably in an extended hallucinogenic state doesn't seem to track with anything I know about psychedelics. I wonder if it's not the best explanation for this. And I've covered psychedelics as a possible cause of stuff like in the Dyatlov Pass episode I did. And again, I'm going to say the same thing where it seems so unlikely that you can get coordination among a group to act and behave the same way on psychedelics. Yes, they'll have shared experiences. Yes, people will have similar visions and see the same entities, but they behave completely differently. It's important to interject and state that ergot poisoning theory is also unlikely because ergot typically causes severe symptoms like gangrene, excruciating pain, all of which were seemingly absent during the dancing plague. And additionally, the levels of ergot required to cause mass hallucinations would likely have been fatal long before observing the behavior. Like seriously, I'm going to stand by the fact, like coupled with the fact that you have psychoactive tolerance, especially with LSD and psilocybin, and you have these low doses, it doesn't track. It just doesn't track at all. However, it is possible there was like way higher doses somehow in this stuff. Or maybe some alchemist was like making up weird batches of God knows what back then, and that could be the root cause, but doesn't seem to me it's caused by an indiscriminate dosing with a psychoactive substance in any way, shape, or form. Convince me otherwise. I'd love to hear differently in the comments. I know a lot of people love the ergot theory. There's so many holes in it. I don't know how I can believe it. Another interesting thing though, like that kind of goes into the mass hysteria aspect, which again, I'm going to just treat as a general category because mass hysteria caused, let's say, not by a substance like stress, famine, plague, could be some kind of mass traumatic event. Isn't that well studied or known? There's a lot of people that talk about it, but it's not something that, it's just something that it's like a catch-all for this situation. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it could be that, it could be some kind of mass hysteria. What else do you call it when you don't know what it is? And that's what I'm trying to say with mass hysteria. It's a placeholder name for saying that, yeah, we don't know what it is. They went into mass hysteria. They called it choreomania. But the one thing I do want to point out is it's not the only case of it. And in Aachen, Germany in 1374, a similar case developed where people in a town began dancing and having movements with their arms that seemed almost uncontrollable and in a frenzy. They had no way to stop them. And in many cases, the people just died from exhaustion. Again, it was never explained. Could be something very similar to what caused this. And it makes me, again, think that there is for sure, the guy with ergot, I think he's on the right path. There's a biological agent at play here that affected, could be in their food, affected their neurological condition or their being overall. I think the one thing I'll say is the more I look at these historical cases, it's easy to jump to conclusions, but man, we really don't have a lot of good evidence. And a lot of people's accounts of this stuff is super sketchy, probably including my own. But the one thing that always stuck in my brain, the thing that stuck in my brain over and over again when I hear this is, I wonder if they weren't infected with something that could cause them to become unhinged enough to start dancing up a storm. And the reason I say this is that I developed a fascination with parasites as an offshoot in college when I was taking fish and wildlife biology stuff. But parasites always fascinated me because of these weird relationships. The thing that I mentioned earlier with the zombie ant fungus, that always stuck with me, of how complex and complicated these life cycles between different species can be, and what can affect or drive a completely healthy animal into a complete stupor like a zombie. So for that reason alone, we're going to explore the possibility that some kind of parasitic infection affected the residents of Strasbourg in 1518. Now, I want to be very clear, this is not in any way, shape, or form a conclusion that I'm saying anyone should draw from this. I would say it's an examination of a possibility. But if you think back to 1518 and what's causing hundreds of people to lose control of their bodies, dancing compulsively until they collapsed. Like I said, mass hysteria, you have ergot poisoning, you have God's punishment, and you have disease and parasite and infection. Now, to be clear, parasites are organisms that live in a host, deriving it of nutrients and using that host for its reproduction. Parasites often target specific species of hosts. One thing that's also important to note is that parasites do develop these super complex life cycles, and sometimes they will end up in the wrong host. Usually they just die off, but every once in a while it can wreak havoc. And we're going to get into one of those stories in a moment. To elaborate why I think something like a viral infection or a parasite can be involved in the dancing plague, I'm going to outline a few kind of common parasites and what they can do. Now, we already covered a case of the zombie ant fungus, and we'll do a few more. But also we're going to cover one disease or syndrome that's actually caught on. It's an autoimmune response to an infection, which again could be a very relevant explanation for the dancing plague. But the first one being Toxoplasma gondii. And this is one of the most common parasites that exist in our day-to-day life, especially if you own a cat. Now, this parasite has developed a relationship and a life cycle that kind of moves between rats or mice and rodents and cats and their poop. And what this parasite does is that once it affects rats or mice, it makes its way into the host brain and it reduces their fear of predators. So all of a sudden, these mice that are naturally fearing and surviving all these predator cats around them by hiding and doing whatever, they're not scared of the cats anymore. So they'll go right up to them and try and hang out with them. And of course, the cat ends up killing the mice and eating it. And ultimately, that parasite becomes now infected in the cat, and it becomes infected into their urine and their feces. And this kind of relationship has been around forever. And since humans have domesticated the cats, we've also, it seems, developed some kind of relationship with both cats and this parasite. Now, Toxoplasma can influence behavior not only of mice, but it seems so in humans. It causes an increase in risk-taking behavior and impulsivity. If you got a cat, you might start behaving more like a cat. And some researchers have also linked that the parasite can cause neurological conditions like schizophrenia, and suggesting that it can subtly alter your decision-making behavior in a way that you're almost unaware of. It can affect dopamine transmitters and also increase the bonding between you and your cat. As much as you might think that you love that cat and that cats are so special to us, and we've had them since the Egyptian times, this is like literally a case you got to ask yourself, have cats infected us since the start of time? That's why we have the little buggers. It seriously makes me wonder that this whole relationships between us and cats has evolved as a result of a parasite that's literally meant to disarm your brain and make you like things. So I don't know. I guess most people wouldn't complain about it, but I'd love to hear your comments on that one. And if you have a cat, if you really think that you got that cat autonomously through your own volition, or if a little parasite told you to. That's a more fun one, but the next ones that I'm going to get into are a little bit more darker because they can cause something called neurocysticercosis. And essentially, we're talking parasites that can override your neurological system and essentially disrupt anything from your thinking to your ability to walk. And the common example that I see in the animal kingdom, and it's present here right where I am in Ontario in Canada, is the parasitic brainworm. And this worm is common in deer, moose, and other large cervids. Sorry, that's like deer. So other large deer species, causing neurological damage that leads to erratic and really weird behavior. The infected animals begin to lose coordination, they begin to wander aimlessly, and exhibit behaviors that put them at risk of predation and exhaustion. The brainworm disrupts the entire nervous system of the animal, causing the loss of motor function almost completely. And you'll see in moose and caribou, as they get into the late stages of brainworm, they'll literally just start walking in circles without stopping, and they'll lose this balance that they have, and they go into something called like a stupor. Essentially, if you can think of it, it's like they're super drunk. And now P. tenuis primarily affects animals. The fact that a parasite can cause such a dramatic loss of brain control over an animal's movement raises the possibility that similar parasitic infections could have affected the humans during the dancing plague. The jerking, the uncontrollable movements that are described is very similar to neurological conditions in animal species affected by brainworms. And brainworms, unfortunately, isn't one of those things that's never jumped over to humans. Now, that being said, the moose and deer type of brainworms, the P. tenuis, that isn't necessarily human transmissible. However, there is a real world example where a pork tapeworm did do that, and it was Luis Ortiz. And in 2015, he began experiencing severe headaches and erratic behavior, and doctors initially thought that he had a brain tumor. As his symptoms continued to worsen, he was experiencing seizures and confusion. Soon, they would discover the cause: a larval cyst from pork tapeworm, T. solium. Now, this condition, known as neurocystosis, can lead to bizarre neurological symptoms, including memory loss, hallucinations, seizures, and in Ortiz's case, the cyst was causing swelling in the brain. For him, an emergency surgery was the cure, and it was required to essentially remove the cyst before it caused any further damage. But what's alarming about that is it does come with it a whole slew of weird and odd behaviors, right? This can cause similar issues with hallucinations and similar issues with mental illness. And it's not like similar to the rabies virus, for example, can infect humans. Now, I don't think it would have been prevalent in that area where this happened during the medieval times. But what I'm trying to say here is that there's very much disease and biological agents that can affect the human brain and turn us into these really weird behaving monkeys. Now, it could be, let's say, the case in the 1518, a infected source of meat or pork or something in that time was hosting some kind of brainworm or something of this similar, and there was transmission to humans. Now, is it likely? I don't think so. I really don't. However, I think there is an explanation here that some kind of infection, bacteria, virus that we're not aware of could have affected the population. One thing that I've came across in researching this is actually a disease that causes an autoimmune response to infections that might actually be an explanation for the dancing plague. Because I don't think even like the brainworm explanation, as cool as that is, I don't think it's the case, because again, it's such a one-off to see it infect an entire town. And again, why would it result in everyone dancing? Doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that any disease or drug that I've ever seen other than Molly or MDMA is going to cause people to break out to dancing. Food for thought. Has anyone explored that angle? That there was like some kind of weird mass MDMA dosing? Anyhow, but there's a disease called Pseudomonas chorea, and it's a neurological disorder that has some historical kind of parallels. And not all conditions that are behavior altering are caused directly by parasites. Now, this neurological disorder that has symptoms that are described as similar to the dancing plague was known as St. Vitus's dance. And this disorder is often occurring after streptococcal infections, things like rheumatic fever or strep throat, and it would cause rapid involuntary movements, particularly in the hands and feet and face. Now, these movements are beyond the control of the afflicted person and resemble dance-like motions. Emotional instability, muscle weakness are also common symptoms, making this condition an intriguing historical parallel to the behaviors during the dancing plague. The one thing, though, that doesn't work with the possibility of this disease or this autoimmune response is that it primarily affects young people and children, and it very rarely has a rapid onset across large groups of people. So again, it's like intriguing as say like brainworm or zombie ant fungus or ergot, but it doesn't explain how an entire town truly broke out into dancing. I just can't put my finger on it. I seriously want your help. Guys, in the comments, please give me an idea. So whether the dancing plague was caused by a neurological condition like Sydenham's chorea is up for argument. So let's get back to Strasbourg and talk about the end of the dancing plague, because it's 1518 and we got shit to do. But after weeks of bizarre, uncontrollable dancing in Strasbourg, it ended in a rather mysterious fashion. The local authorities, baffled by this situation, initially attempted to manage the outbreak by encouraging more dancers, hiring musicians, offering ritual sacrifices to the Saint Vitus. But one of the things they decided to do was transport the afflicted people themselves to the shrine of Saint Vitus, who happened to be this patron saint of dancers. It was located in the nearby mountains not too far away, and the belief was that once they got them there, it could possibly be a cure. The pilgrimage and the religious intervention would break the curse once and for all. Upon reaching the shrine, the dancers were each given red shoes and each made to participate in rituals believed to offer spiritual healing. The religious approach seemed to be effective as after that moment, the outbreak gradually subsided after the dancers reached the shrine. Historians still debate whether or not the dancing ceased because of the religious offering, but clearly, whether it was to the placebo effect, natural exhaustion, or the waning of whatever environmental trigger caused it, historians still debate what actually caused the dancing, whether it was due to religious belief, natural exhaustion, the waning of whatever psychological, biological, or environmental thing triggered its onset. But what is clear is that by September of 1518, the strange epidemic came to an end, leaving behind way more questions than answers. There's no firm number on the amount of people that actually died, but it's thought to be about 15. And our character, Troffea, the woman that we mentioned at the start, whose strange and uncontrollable movements started it all, was perhaps the most mysterious figure of all. On that warm day in July, she stepped into the street and began dancing without reason. For days, she danced uncontrollably, her body defying exhaustion until she collapsed, only to be replaced by dozens more. Troffea, like many of the others, eventually disappeared from the historical record, and her fate is actually unknown, leaving behind a series of unsettling questions. Did she recover from this bizarre condition? Or perhaps she's the start of it all. If it was some kind of mass hysteria outbreak of one person just following the other person, maybe she went hiding because she didn't want to be blamed. But to this day, the historical records of her end with the dancing plague. But in the end, whether Frau was an unwitting victim of something like ergot, some kind of biological infection or parasite, some kind of mass psychosis, we'll never know. It could be that she was the catalyst of it all. It only takes one person to start dancing. It's like a dance floor at a wedding. There's nobody on it, but once that first person gets up there, you just see everyone else trickle in, person after person. So maybe it was just a case of everyone following the leader. But all we do know is that we have way more questions than answers at the end of this, and I don't think we're going to get any as history moves forward unless we happen to find some kind of secret journal out there. What an interesting story. What an unknown. Holy shit. I really can't put my finger on it. None of the theories make sense. I'd love to know your comments. And what I will say, the dancing plague of 1518, though, what do you think is a biological anomaly like ergot, or perhaps some kind of viral infection? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment, reach out. Anyhow, thanks again. We'll see you next week as well.